All right, welcome back to the beautiful Pacific Northwest, the land of plaid and coffee. This is David and PacWest Bigfoot. We're going to dive in right now and jump into another updated version of an older story here on PacWest Bigfoot. This is actually one of my favorites too, by the way. I absolutely love it. It was pretty fun to get this report from the lady. And she was kind enough to give it to us. So here we go, this time without too many clearing throats and hacks and coughs and everything else. However, like I said, I will never, ever, ever seek forgiveness for taking a nice long sip of some great Sasquatch coffee. So there you go. Although I have no coffee in front of me right now, so bear with me. All right, here we go. Young woman gets dragged in a tent by Bigfoot along the Klamath River. It's one thing to play with the idea that Bigfoot might exist. It is a whole other to have not just one, but two of them drag your tent with you in it. I know it sounds extraordinary, and it was, to tell you the truth, and it is what happened that spring break to me in Northern California. And yes, I thought at the time I was in mortal danger. But here is my encounter, Dave, and I hope it keeps you and others safe. My spring breaks are different. It was the late 1990s, and I was attending UC Davis at the time. If you do not know, Davis is located southwest of Sacramento, California, about 25 minutes at the most given decent traffic. If not, count on an hour or two. Originally, however, I am from Wairika, born and raised. Back then, I was what you called a tree-hugging hippie. The earth is my mother druid college girl, and I mean that in a good way. Today, well, I am the mother of two, a real upper-middle-class entrepreneur out of Chico, California. A real 360 turn, to tell you the truth. And that is about as much as you are going to get to know of me, at least for now. I am thinking about the interview, however. But until then, I do want to share what happened that spring break. Seriously, I was dragged while in my tent while camping alone along the Klamath River in Northern California. What is funny, though, were the signs that even a seasoned camper like myself, who loved to spend time in the woods, should have noticed, but didn't. But I didn't, and that was my bad, I suppose. I still camp with my family today. The chances of an encounter like that again would be astronomical at best, I believe. And eventually I got past the fear. However, I am cautious, especially with my kids, while enjoying the outdoors today. Back then, though, my spring breaks were different than most of my classmates. While they opted for Cancun, San Diego, and even Florida, I enjoyed my backyard, the Pacific Northwest, especially along the Klamath River, not far from where I am from in Wairika. That spring, my third year in college to be exact, I would head home for 4 nights of camping, a couple of nights spent with Mom and Dad for good measure. There is a little campground not too far away from Wairika, out near Scott Bar. But for now, I will keep the name of the exact site to myself. For now, at least. I got to take off almost a whole day early, before most anyone and everyone else. My class load that day before spring break was basically non-existent. So I packed up some clothes and took the few hours or so ride back home to see Mom and Dad before I would head out camping for the better part of that week. I decided to go ahead and stay that first night with my parents and head off the next morning to the campground. Besides, after that long drive, the extra 45 minutes driving time to the campground was not something I really wanted to do. Besides, it was not like I had reservations. It was first come, first serve at that particular place. Eastbound and down, loaded up, and so my mom and dad were there, typical "we have not seen you in forever" selves that evening. And of course, Dad had all my camping gear ready for me to load up, laying on the inside of the garage. I miss my dad. I don't know, he was just a great guy and a real planner. I was and am a planner too. The only thing I was not was apparently not in tune to the signs that would be around me while camping. I mean, seriously, I wish I had my mother's intuition instead of the planner thing at the time. Either way, it is over and gone, a scary memory put away in the back of the sock drawer, and almost all but forgotten today. But there were signs, little things, that later I would come to see as a blatant sign of predators about in the woods around me. I was apparently just oblivious to it, or simply was not familiar with this type of predator, which of course I was not at the time. Usually, though, I'm really good about being out in the back country, or bush if you will. I have been on my own out there many times, more than I could count. Okay, maybe not that much, but you get what I mean. Maybe it was because of all the studying I'd been doing, and brought some reading with me I had to catch up on that made me simply miss it all. Either way, I should have seen the sign, but I did not. I woke up the next morning with some of my dad's favorite coffee waiting for me, plus a short stack of Mom's pancakes ready to be devoured. I ate, said my goodbyes, and was on the road again. But this time, not for hours, actually. Less than an hour for sure. Oh, and by the way, I still visit that campground with my family today to fish. However, we do not camp there, ever. Hikers in retreat. I unloaded the tent, the fishing gear, and of course my bedding, the ice chest, and my favorite old camping chair. And yes, a couple of large books in American history and a biographical study on Martin Luther King Jr. I had just purchased. Light reading for the week. Ha! I gathered some wood first, then set up the tent. After all that, the morning was half over, so I figured I would fish for a while. I would take an afternoon hike down the river and back, then read some more. I made my third or fourth cast, I remember, as I watched as 4 to 5 hikers passed by along the trail on the opposite side of the river. It was a small trail, I remember, that wrapped around the mountain just northwest of the campgrounds and back down towards the river. From there, you could continue or turn around and head back, but either way, that track would take them a couple hours or so just to get there and back again, to where I was watching them disappear into the forest ahead. I kept casting for a bit. I was fly fishing, by the way, something new for me at the time. No joke, I took a course on it at school. Seriously, I did. I was getting better with every cast, too, and by the umpteenth cast, I had a fish on. While I was a little hippie-ish, I was a meat eater, and I loved trout and salmon. I reeled it in, took the hook out, and measured the thing. A perfect 13 inches, just enough for dinner that night, I thought. At that moment, I heard the hikers coming back up the trail. They should have been gone for at least a couple hours, but there they were, and they seemed to be in a hurry, too. Personally, at the time, I was hoping they were okay, and they seemed to be. However, they kept looking back behind them as they were now practically speed-walking up that trail. They were too far away to ask if anything was the matter or even say anything to them. Then again, they were out of sight, but not before they came to a complete stop and stood there looking back towards the forest from which they had just come from for a pretty long moment. Once they were gone, though, everything was pretty quiet for the rest of the afternoon. Just some rafters here and there checking out the fly-fishing college girl as they floated by was all, and a few whistles. Click-clack goes the rocks. I would only be there less than 48 hours before I would leave in a rush, and I believe it started when I saw the hikers in retreat. Eventually I would come to understand that I believe they were scared off by a Bigfoot earlier that day. I returned from my short walk down the river and took out the 2 trout I ended up catching earlier and started cooking them. The sun was then setting below the horizon of the mountains, which made it seem a little darker than it should be around that time. At first, I thought it was just some loud cracks from the fire that was making the noise, but my back was turned to it as I fixed up my bedding in the tent and while the foil-wrapped trout cooked over the fire. It was not until I came out of the tent I heard it again that I figured out that it was clacking coming from just across the river. It sounded like rocks being hit together. Personally, at the time, however, I figured it was a woodpecker or some bird cracking something open against a rock, at least. At least I did at first. But it continued for about an hour. Every few minutes or so, I could hear the clacking of what I started to believe were rocks being hit together. I walked down to the river, which is about maybe 15 yards away from my campsite, picked up 2 stones and hit them together. That was the same sound I'd heard from across the river. After I'd done that, the clacking from across the river stopped. I thought to myself, what hits rocks together like that other than people? So that was it. Someone was hiking along, more like a couple people or more, and using the sound of clacking rocks to either keep contact with the other, or they were simply just clacking them together for whatever reason. I could not see anyone as it was too dark by then, but that was the reason for the sound, I believed at the time. Looking back today, and after reading up on the subject of Bigfoot, I know better now. The only other thing I remember from that night were the crickets. They would start, stop, and start again from time to time. Of course, that did make me nervous, as that is usually a telltale sign of an animal lurking about. However, I was not that nervous, as I believed it was either a mountain lion, black bear, or even something as small as a raccoon or a bobcat at best. Who would have thought it could be a 500-plus pound, 8 or more foot tall monster? I know I wasn't at the time. The crickets came, and the crickets went. It was not until near midnight that they came and seemed to stay. I then put the book down and headed off to bed. And of course, to keep wild animals at bay, I played the radio low throughout the night. Besides, I always fell asleep with the radio playing in the background, no matter where I am. Impressions of an escape artist. The next day, while it would be my last for a long time out in the woods, started off rather perfectly. Instead of fly fishing, I did get my line in the water, but this time I let it float down to a small pool along the river to sit and hopefully draw in a trout while I cooked breakfast. That morning was orange juice and a couple of croissants my mother apparently slipped into an ice chest and bag. So, instead of cooking, I got to eating and walking around a bit. I decided to see if I could find some animal tracks or whatever it was hanging around the night before I started reading. So I walked around in a pretty wide circle around my camp. I would say it was about 30 or so yards back from my side at least. It was not until I neared a path that led to the other campsites further into the campground itself that I found, well, impressions. They were not tracks we know are completely visible to the human eye. These were impressions at best. However, they were rather long impressions. I thought of a bear at first, as they are sometimes seen as double step and make one big track or print with front and back paws together. But these looked a little different than what I'd seen 1,000 times with Mom and Dad out here in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. It took a bit of a stretch to see it, but I swear at the time I could make out footprint, like a human footprint. But as I said, it was a stretch to see it that way. What impressions I could make out seemed to lead towards my campsite from the edge of the river. Stop about 10 or so yards and back on my site itself, then head back off north deeper into the campgrounds and forest. Maybe it was someone who was just out for a midnight walk, saw my camp, and decided not to bother me. I was not completely alone, as there were at least a couple other campers about 100 yards or more south of me along the river. At least that is what I remember. The reason being was seeing the same car come in and out, and in again the day before, and it did not leave, that I know of after that. So there must have been other campers, not many, but a couple at least, around the area. Either way, it was a person or bear. That is what I decided it had to be. I went back to fishing the rest of the morning after that. Whoops and whistles from across the river. At first I thought it was some guys my age or some old perverts across the river whistling at me. Of course, I never saw them. I just heard whistling and even a whoop here and there. It sounded human, at least from where I was standing along the river it did. I had decided earlier to pack a small, light lunch and walk down the river about a mile and do some fly fishing in a part of the river that was almost completely flat and placid right before some small white water started. There were plenty of raptors that day, but I would have known for sure if it was one of them making the sounds. These whistles and whoops came across the river up near the trail. Now, thinking back to the day before, I started feeling a little weird. People hiking, a hike that should have taken at least a couple hours, came back within less than 20 minutes and looked to be in a hurry. Was there someone or some bad or menacing people living out there or just hanging out on that side of the river harassing people? And do they now want to harass me? Other questions started reeling through my mind, but it was not until I realized a few minutes later, when my brain slowed down, that I noticed the whistles and whoops had stopped and all was quiet again. I started casting out as a couple of rafters floated around the bend. This time, it was two small families having fun blasting each other with large water cannons and laughing about it as they waved at me and passed on by. The sounds disappeared, even those from across the river, and I soon felt safe and fine once again. The world was right as rain, and it was beautiful as well as I took in all I could as I fished. I caught 3 that afternoon, all trout over 15 inches, dragged in my tent by Bigfoot. I went for another short hike late in the day after reading, about a mile and a half up the river, this time to a rock outcropping that practically hung over the river. From there you could not see much, as there was a bend to the left and right of me in the river, so my view was limited. However, I could see a small mountain ahead of me across the river. Once every 30 minutes or so, people fishing in boats would float by and wave, and of course the river guides would wave at the girl a little more energetically as they came around the bend and took notice of me. But there must have been people hanging out up the trail a bit. I could hear the muffled sound of voices over there from time to time. Eventually I would come to believe they were not human voices. I figured they were people at first just out of earshot, and that was the reason the voices sounded like a garbled mess. They were just too far away. But looking back later, the garbled sounds and muttering seemed to be something else, a different language, I suppose. It was getting darker, and I was getting hungry. That second night would be fish again, but this time I had pasta salad my mom had made and thrown into a giant plastic bag for me and hid in the ice chest. So, it was pasta, a little bit of fish eventually, and some reading. I listened to the radio until at least 11 p.m. After that, I decided to stoke the fire a bit and add a few logs to it to add a little more light around camp for a little longer that evening. With all the little weird things heard and noticed, I was not feeling fearful by any means, I remember, but I did want to be safe as possible, and animals, for the most part, hate fire. At least that is what I have been told and have read 100 times by that point. The crickets were chirping, so by the time I decided to turn in, everything, seemed okay and safe. So I climbed into the tent, I remember, turned the radio down to a volume I could almost not hear myself, and soon fell asleep. I did not know what time it was at that moment, but I knew it had to be at least somewhere around 3 a.m. when I heard the whooping sound again. This time, however, it came from the backside of my tent. It was close, not more than 15 feet away at the most. And that was not the worst part about hearing something so scary in the middle of the night. It was the fact that there came an answer in the form of a grunt of sorts from the opposite direction. Was someone playing a twisted joke on the lone woman camper? If so, it was not funny. Actually, it was just the opposite. I was starting to feel really scared. Whoever it was, I thought at that moment, started walking toward my tent from behind me. Big, heavy, whoever they were, they had to be to make the ground almost feel like it was vibrating as they approached the tent. They reached the backside and stopped for a second, and all I could see was the ambient light that was there disappear, and I mean it went completely black behind that tent. I slowly started rolling over to get the bear spray and keys out of the side pocket of my backpack. Whoever it was going to feel the pain. If I had a gun, I probably would have fired it off in the air just to scare them off. But as I grabbed the keys and had my fingertips on the spray, that is when I found myself tumbling to the other side of the tent and smacking the back of my head on the ground hard. I was being dragged. It was not far. It felt to be about 4 or 5 feet at most before I was dropped. Whoever it was dropped me, then walked off towards the river. I decided not to wait around for them to return, as I remember scrambling at that point for the keys that fell out of my hand. I knew I was close to my vehicle, so all I needed to do was get the keys, unzip the tent, and run about 15 or so feet to it. And fortunately, I left the car unlocked. Why would you lock it while out here anyways? I found the keys, and then I found the zipper. I also found myself being dragged again from behind. This time, however, I crawled out of the tent and ended up rolling on the ground, scraping my knees and elbows really bad. But the pain would not be noticed until later. For now, it was simply the feelings of fight or flight that took over. I scrambled to my feet and ran for the car. That moment in the middle of the running, I heard the most blood-curdling scream ever, almost ever, come from behind me. I kept running. These things, they were not people. Nobody can scream like that. I dove towards the car, opened the door, and shut it, locking it behind me. I was terrified at that point, so getting to the right key took a few seconds as my hands were shaking wildly. Finally, I got it. I put the key in the ignition, But before I turned the old beetle over, I looked up and out the front window. I shouldn't have, but I did, and it changed my life forever. I cannot see their face, or any real features, other than stature and bulk of what was a Bigfoot. This thing was humongous, to say the least. I can tell you that this thing was at least 8 to 9 feet tall. Some say a Bigfoot have no real neck. I noticed a little bit on this one, but I cannot be sure. Its arms were long, down around its knees or further, but unfortunately, because the firelight was almost all but gone, that was all I could make out. As I sat there long enough to get a look at that large figure, with my neck cranked forward and up, there came a growl and then another scream to the left of the vehicle. This one was louder, angrier sounding than the last one. I could not see where the other creature was exactly, but with the volume of the scream that was just as deafening in the car with the windows rolled up as it would have been outside. My gut started telling me to go, and fast. I turned the car over, backed up a bit, then threw that thing into first and peeled out of there, making skidding sounds as I hit the pavement. I was almost out of there. I was out of there, safe, on the road, and not looking back. I would not go back for anything, not even my books that I would have to buy again. At least I was safe and alive to do so. Still camping today. I still camp today. Call me courageous, nuts, or just call me someone who knows that something like that happening twice would be like getting struck by lightning. Well, twice. Of course, I'm very cautious with my own family out and about in the woods, as I said, sometimes even to a fault, as I said before. Just ask my 2 girls. They never get to go off alone when camping or hiking with Dad and Mom, even today, and they are teenagers. But that is my story, Dave. Thanks. Joanna.